Nabalenge samalola ya samdi distillation de shuyin. Taringi lenje sanro nange leze di nang. Nyedong ni seni da juji. Ce ni shu zapye tang ni shu zogu. Ni nang ni giring. Gyagar gesa dilisabe nang do. Gyagar gyayung pedun gyabgyur sobe. Tsojin ting dunbe ting. Benden sekyong pembasiring chogi. Unje sungshe nangbashi. Pyogi ninding chambane. Surdun shube. Chambatangpudi. Shamla sinse yongbashu. Sageda Pazo, Sungshe de Chazang Yengenang Yimbashi Redu.
दिखने में तिब्बती है मगर दिमाग और हालचाल में सब भारतीय ही है so many issues came up during this conference. I'm very grateful to the religious personages who are represented here. And Professor Anand Kumarji, we have known for more than 2-3 decades. We have worked together on many occasions. And Indreshji, now more than, I remember when he started Himalaya Parivar in 2002 in Varmaji's place. That was perhaps one of our first meetings, but since then, he has been very, very actively associated with the cause of Tibet in moving it forward, to getting people together. And as he said today, Bharat Divas Sahayog Manch kabhi bacche bhi paida ho gaya. So there are many other organizations that have sprung up in the years. And in the last few years, I have not been very actively involved with the Indian Tibet support groups. So I find that now there are many other new organizations that have come up over the last few years. And Krimiji has always been there, like Surendra Kumarji is, we were not childhood friends, but we seem like childhood friends, having worked in Delhi for a long time. And then Sujit Kumarji, I met him last year for the first time in Italy at the International Parliamentarians Alliance on China conference, where Sujitji represented the Indian Parliament in this group of parliamentarians who take up action against China. So it's a great honor personally for me and also on behalf of the Central Tibetan Administration to be having this physical meeting after many years. Since Surendraji said that I came 8-9 hours by car yesterday, and immediately after this I have to go back to Dharamsala again another 9 hours. So maybe I should speak for another 3 hours. Now we are at least 45 minutes beyond schedule, but since having traveled for 18 hours, at least I should spend a little time to report to you as Tibet supporters as to how we think, how the Central Tibetan Administration perceives the Tibet situation and how we are trying to work towards resolving the Sino-Tibet conflict. आजकल हम लोग तिब्बत इशू भी नहीं बोलते हैं, इसको Sino-Tibet conflict, इसका status भी, शब्दों में भी इसको we have to give that significance to the whole conflict. So maybe first I'll touch on the history part, which I think Sujitji also touched on, talking about Michael van Walt van Praag's book, Tibet Brief 2020. And also I want to mention the fact that there is another book by a Chinese professor called Professor Lau Han Tin, who is now in United States, retired in San Diego. So these two books, written one by a Chinese professor and another by a Western professor, and their approaches towards the research on Tibet history is totally different. That is why, and also the fact that it's not like Tibetans have not written history about Tibet. It has been there since Shagapa's time in the 60s. And there have been many more books on the historical status of Tibet. But unfortunately, Tibetan version of Tibetan history would be construed propaganda And unfortunately also over the last many decades, China's propaganda has been so strong and pervasive that almost every country in the world and every people in the world believe that Tibet must have been part of China since time immemorial or since antiquity, as Chinese government says. When we talk about Michael's book, Tibet 2020, this book was published about 2 years ago. And 8 years before that, within 8 years, Michael met with 70, 80 scholars, not just from China, but from many countries in Inner Asia. And he came to the conclusion that whether it is the Tibet-Mongol relationship, which was earlier than Mongol-China relationship. For the Chinese, the period of Yuan is only between that period when the Mongols ruled China. But the Yuans are Mongols. They existed even before the Yuan and after the Yuan. And that was one dynasty of the Tibetans, the Sakya dynasty in 13th and 14th century. Then China was occupied but taken over by the Ming, who are the real Chinese, because the Mongolians are not Chinese. The Ming ruled China from 1368 to 1644. And we had 3 dynasties between that. We had the Pamodrupa dynasty, we had the Rinpoche dynasty, we had the Debunking dynasty for almost 300 years. Then Chinese came under the rule of the Manchus. If you had watched Kung Fu movies, you will see that in these Kung Fu movies, Chinese are always the protagonists, and the Manchus are always the antagonists. That is because the societal perspective of the Chinese people is that Manchus are not Chinese. So from 1644 to 1911, even there, the 5th Dalai Lama had taken over the temporal and spiritual leadership of the Tibetans in 1642, 2 years before the Mings took over China. And the Mings are real Chinese, but we didn't have much relation with the Mings between that period. From 1368 to 1644. From 1644 to 1911 was the period when the Manchus took over China, and the Manchus are not Chinese. So Michael proves that whether it's Tibet's relationship with Mongols, or Tibet's relationship with the Mings, or Tibet's relationship with the Qing, if Qing and Yuan can be considered as Chinese dynasties, and as per international law today, Tibet has never been considered part of China. And what Professor Lau, the Chinese professor, did was to study only the imperial Chinese historical records. He didn't refer to any other documents. And imperial Chinese records, whether it is the Yuan or the Ming or the Qings, they have never ever considered Tibet as part of China. And these 2 books have come out in the last 2 years, and the Chinese government has not been able to come up with any response to these 2 historical narratives. Now, unfortunately, as I said before, much of the Western world depend on Chinese documents for Asian history, which happens to be distorted. Now, that is why the present cabinet of the Central Tibetan Administration, even though we continue to persist with the middle way approach, where the official position of His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been, and whenever we talk about negotiation, Chinese government put these preconditions on His Holiness, saying that His Holiness should say that Taiwan is part of Tibet, or His Holiness should say that Tibet has been part of China since antiquity. And His Holiness is a Buddhist monk. He cannot lie on history. That is why His Holiness came up with this very wise answer, saying that I am not a historian. Let us leave history to historians. What is more important is the future of the Tibetan people. So that is why he adopted the middle way approach. Considering the reality of the situation inside Tibet. So when we first came into exile, His Holiness keeps repeating this statement or this story that when His Holiness moved or was staying in Missouri, he had this first international conference, press conference. And so when somebody asked about the government of Tibet, then His Holiness said, wherever me and my kashak is where the Tibetan government is. A few days after that, the Indian government sent an emissary saying that we do not recognize Tibetan government in exile. And since that, His Holiness never tried with any of the successive Indian governments to seek recognition of the Tibetan government in exile, unless that comes from the Indian government. If Indian government decides to accept Tibetan government in exile, we'll be very happy to welcome it. But as Indreshji also spoke about the multiplicity of issues that confronts India, we do not want to become an aberrance, in the process. But we do. I want to assure you that we do have very good relationship with the Indian government, a very open relationship, very transparent relationship. But if, as the attendees of this conference believe that Tibet should gain independence, then it cannot. The support cannot come only from the public. There has to be a government intention or intervention to give us the encouragement that this is also possible. Right now, it's difficult to get that sense. And when I'm asked about Indian government's position on Tibet, His Holiness used to say the Indian government is very overcautious when it comes to China. Now I tell other people, maybe it's time to remove the over, but Indian government still is cautious from the developments that we are hearing today also. So if there has to be affirmative thinking from the CTA also, then there has to be affirmative support from governments that matter. That's also important. So now, with these two books, we inform the international community that if you keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of People's Republic of China, then we tell them you are going against international law. Because the only one agreement that we have with Communist China is 17-point agreement, which was forced upon us in May 1951. And that is post-invasion of China, of Chamdo in October 1950. So under international law, any agreement post-aggression is not valid. It's null and void. So if international law has to be applied, it has to be applied to every country, every people. Tibet cannot be an exception to this just because Tibet is under China's occupation. So we also tell the international community, on the one hand, you keep saying Tibet is part of PRC at the behest of the Chinese government, which incidentally, the Indian government decided not to reiterate its statements since 2014. There has been some change. 2010? 2010 onwards. So the Indian government has not repeated that statement. Even as close as post to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, the Chinese government asked every embassy of its in other countries to seek reconfirmation of the One China policy, and even at that time, Indian government said that we do not reiterate what we have already stated before. So these are subtle messages that are being sent to China. Whereas when countries keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of PRC at the behest of the Chinese government, and then on the other hand, maybe to appease His Holiness, keeps repeating the statement that they support negotiation between the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Chinese government. We tell the international community these two don't go together. Because Chinese government rules Tibet with an iron hand. We are talking about the George Orwell's book 1984, which has now turned into reality inside China, where every single thing is monitored by the government. Every movement of the people are monitored by the government. And I was thinking this morning, last night, when we arrived around 9 o'clock at night, I received 2-3 communications saying there are a lot of large-scale protests going on in China. And then BBC was the first to cover on international news last night. And this morning, it was being taken up by Indian media also. And this time, what is happening in China, the protests that seem to be sporadic in different places, coming from Shanghai to Beijing to Nanjing to Chongqing and Urumqi. In fact, it was said that it was fueled by an event in Urumqi where a building was burning, and because of zero COVID policy, people were locked inside and they couldn't come out of the house. So that triggered the protests inside China, and many believe that this is happening in many campuses around China. So these are very new, just recent, just yesterday, as we speak, it's going on in the last few days. And it's very important to watch these developments, because I've always said that if there could be anything that destabilizes China, it could be implosion within China. Of course, economy is very bad. But then, let me come back to how our narrative, how we explain to the international community about the historical angle, that China rules inside Tibet with an iron hand, and the whole international community keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of PRC. Then where is the reason for China to come and talk to us? हमारे पास आने का क्या वजह रहा चीन को? Because there's no reason for them to come to talk to us, because they rule Tibet with an iron hand, and the whole international community keeps saying Tibet is part of PRC, more like saying we give you a blank check to do whatever you want in Tibet and we won't say anything. Right? But we tell the international community, we lived on the Tibetan plateau for many centuries by ourselves, isolated from the world, thinking that Himalayas and all the mountain ranges that surrounds us will protect us. And without our knowledge, others have been deciding for us, whether it's British India or China or Russia or whoever. Now when we are in exile, every other country is deciding for us that Tibet is part of PRC. Now tell me, how many people have read Tibetan history to claim that? कितने लोगों ने पढ़ा है तिब्बती इतिहास को? Not many people know, but for their own economic benefit, they say things which Chinese government want them to say. Now the question is, there are so many countries in this world where one country has invaded another country. Do you find any other instance in this world where this country who invaded the other country keeps claiming or tells other countries to say that this is part of us? हमने तो नहीं सुना. Look at China itself. China maybe, are the Chinese saying that the other countries should say that Manchuria is part of China, or Mongolia is part of China, or East Turkestan is part of China? No. Why it is happening only with Tibet? That is because the Chinese government knows that they have no legitimacy to rule Tibet. And the international community has no right to grant any legitimacy for China to rule Tibet. If it has to be resolved, then that legitimacy can be given only by His Holiness Dalai Lama or the Tibetan people after reaching a solution. So that is what we try to tell the international community, that this is what it is, with a multiple impact of sending a message to the Chinese government, as well as tell the international community that this is not the right thing. That is why we made some efforts, even though Indreshji says that situation cannot be compared between the United States and India. Of course, India has to face much more different situation than United States, but United States having given this support itself is very important for us. So this April, we approached the US Congress. We came out with several suggestions for action in the Congress. And what happened in June, one was that we managed to, our friends in the Congress managed to organize a experts' testimony on the historical status of Tibet. Now it is on the record of the US Congress that Tibet was an independent country. And on the other hand, based on similar line, we also, the Congress has also moved a bill in the House in countering China's false narrative on Tibetan history and recognizing Tibet as an unresolved conflict. On these two issues, it's still being worked on. Now, if the new Congress comes in, the new House comes in, we may have to introduce the bill again in the House, and then in the Senate. It might take some time, but these are some of the progress that we have made towards seeking recognition of the historical status of Tibet, which is important. Otherwise, not many people know that His Holiness had climbed down from independence to middle way to find a mutually beneficial, negotiated solution, because I always tell my people that we have to understand these two premises. One is that if the Tibetan issue has to be, the Sino-Tibet conflict needs to be resolved in a non-violent way. If China breaks up, that's a different matter. But otherwise, we will have to talk with the Chinese government. There's no other way. We can't expect India to send its army to fight against the Chinese for the Tibetans. No. And the other reality also, just to make sure that we are not disappointed in the future when things are not achieved, we have to be, our expectations also needs to be realistic. We don't expect Indian government to leave aside their national interests and put Tibet's national interests first. No. If this cannot happen with the government of India, it cannot happen with any other governments in the world. So this reality also we have to understand. So based on these two realities, then we have to set up our expectations and see how we can maneuver situations. So lately, of course, it has only been about 1.5 months that I took over the Sikyongship of Central Tibetan Administration, and we also traveled around the world through several countries. And the perception that, the feeling that we are getting is that, of course, US and Canada has been strong supporters for a long time. Even though Canada doesn't have an act, it behaves in a manner similar to US government. And with the government of India, as I mentioned before also, we have very good understanding and support and very transparent relationship. And things in Europe are changing. At the level of perception is changing. There is a realization that the immediate problem is Russia, but the long-term challenge is definitely China. But now we have to see how that perception transforms into policy and program level. So this is something, it's a good time for us to speak about Tibet or East Turkestan or Inner Mongolians or Hong Kongers. In Europe, some of them are just waking up. It's a very complicated system with 27 countries, and everybody is developing their own China strategy. Maybe we'll look for a time when Europeans are more united in their approach, in their foreign policy approach, particularly Indochina or China. That's why we keep telling the Europeans, don't look at us only from the perspective of a victim of communist China. If you can start looking at us as partners, and if you want to bring about positive changes in China eventually, you need both internal and external forces. And Tibetans are the internal forces. East Turkestanis are the internal forces. Mongolians are the internal forces. So also the Hong Kongers and Taiwanese. So if we all can work together from that perspective, not looking only from the perspective of a victim, but as a partner to bring about changes in China, then there could be better cooperation and equal cooperation. We also tell the Europeans, it's Americans, it is Europeans it is Japanese, it's Taiwanese, all these countries who invested so much money in China created this monster called China today. So now you can't expect America alone to contain China. China has become too big for that. So there has to be transatlantic cooperation, working along with other liberal democracies in the world, if you have to really contain China and bring changes, positive changes in China. So this is just our approach to the international community. We have been to Japan also. We are seeing a lot of new developments, international developments. As we speak also, things are changing. It's very dynamic, very fluid. Every single day we have to watch. But something that we need to watch out over the last few days that has been happening in China in the last few days are going to be very, very consequential. So this situation needs to be watched, and we also have to see how and what we can do as Tibet support groups or Tibetans from outside China. If you look at the movements that are happening in Iran, the support from the international community is also important. Expressions of support for these movements are also important if it emanates from different parts of the world. So that'll be useful. So I really appreciate all the initiatives that Indresh mentioned about, Sujit ji mentioned about, particularly with the All-Party Indian Parliamentary Forum for Tibet. I myself was personally involved in rejuvenating that in 2002 when I was the director of Tibetan Parliamentary and Policy Research Center. And then again, there has always been ups and downs in the formations of these groups and also the functions of these groups, depending on the leadership and participation of the members. It's not like here you are all represented from east to west, from north to south, from all parts of India, and there are so many others who are not represented here. So similarly in the parliament also, there is a lot of sympathy for the cause of Tibet, but those needs to be turned into concrete action. I think even though there are many members of parliament who are acquainted with foreign policy issues, particularly with in relation to China, there are many others who also don't know about the situation there. So it's very important that we spread awareness on that.